So welcome everybody to the Liberal Party New South Wales Division Defence and National Security Policy Branch virtual event on the Chinese Communist government's encroachment and overt coercion across multiple Pacific Island nations. We have opened up this event to non-party members, and so welcome to those of you who are not members of the Liberal Party. I understand also that we had some interest from our Liberal Party cousins in the state of Victoria, so welcome to you as well. One would think that given this is Australia's backyard, that the average Australian would understand this issue well and that our media would be focused on it, and that the Australian government, DFAT and others would be well across these developments and have very strong plans to counter these activities and keep us safe. And I might add, keep the Pacific Islands safe from Chinese aggression. So that's what we're pretty much going to be talking about today, as you would have seen from the emails that we've sent out with regard to the presentation. I'm going to now just give a brief overview of our esteemed speaker, Cleo Paskal. She is an Associate Fellow in both the Asia Pacific Program and the Energy, Environment and Resources Department at Chatham House, or also known as the Royal Institute of International Affairs, as well as a non-resident senior fellow for the Indo-Pacific in the Centre on Military and Political Power, chaired by General H.R. McMaster at the Foundation for Defence of Democracies, and is also on the International Board of Advisors of the Kalinga Institute of Indo-Pacific Studies. She's also lead author on the recently released Chatham House report titled Indo-Pacific Strategies, Perceptions and Partnerships, The View from 7 Countries. For close to 2 years, she and Chatham House have been researching changes in strategic perceptions of the Indo-Pacific from the points of view of 7 countries: the United States, United Kingdom, France, India, the Kingdom of Tonga, Japan, and China. And this report was actually partly funded by the Australian Department of Defence. You may also have noticed that Cleo recently authored an article in India's The Sunday Guardian titled How China Buys Foreign Politicians, a case study, focusing on the Solomon Islands and their current Prime Minister's antics with Chinese money and 39 MPs. This particular piece hit a nerve with a number of New Zealand academics, and we'll be discussing New Zealand's role in the Pacific Islands today as well. She also received a bit of ad hominem attack from Aussie academics on that piece. Cleo has also been one of the few people willing to assist Premier Daniel Soudani of the Solomon Islands' largest province, Mailata, one of the few remaining Australian allies in Solomon Islands. And those of you Liberal Party members who are members of our Defence and National Security Policy Branch are aware that we've been discussing this over the last few months. And so now we have an opportunity to really get into the weeds and understand more about why this is important to the national security of Australia and indeed the Pacific Islands, whom we claim as our friends and family. So you'd remember that when Premier Soudani had health issues that could not be treated in the Solomon Islands, Australia didn't really help very much. But the President of Taiwan herself stepped in, flying him to Taiwan for treatment. And indeed, Premier Soudani is still in Brisbane. I could go on, but lastly, she was also widely quoted in the recent article from Politico titled Meth, Vanilla and Gulags, How China Has Overtaken the South Pacific One Island at a Time, focused on Chinese incursions and coercive activities in Tonga, which if you haven't read, it will shock the hell out of you. I did put that link into an email that we sent around to branch members yesterday. So if you haven't read it, I advise you to. So now I'd like to hand over to our branch secretary, James Kell, to provide some comments of his own, some housekeeping, some information, and then who he'll throw to Cleo directly. Thanks, mate. Over to you, James. You're muted.
Right. Thanks, Lincoln. I'm very excited myself to have Cleo talk today. The gutsy investigative journalists and researchers are few and far between, and they're very important, especially at this time. So I'm going to, and of course, this area, I think everyone here acknowledges how important it is to maintain Australia's options, strategic options, now and in the future. And encirclement is absolutely a strategy that is being adopted and employed against us, and we need to remedy that immediately. Now, Cleo is going to do a TED-style talk for about 20 odd minutes. We're going to have polls throughout, and I'm actually going to launch, I'm going to start off by polling with a provocative question to you guys. So let me know if you can see this. I'm going to launch this as a sample. So put your vote in now. And we'll be asking a couple more of those poll questions throughout. You yourselves will be able to ask questions. There's three shapes down your bottom right: a triangle, a square, and a circle. If you press that and then go for Q&A, you can create a question. You can ask a question. You can also vote each other's questions up. I suggest you do that. Vote up the good questions, because at the end of this, Lincoln and I will be asking a couple of questions and then opening it up to everybody. And I'll be starting with the most voted questions. This is being recorded. We're going to be opening this up because it is important that the message gets out there. So I hope you enjoy. I'm stoked that we've got Cleo Paskal here, and I'm going to hand it over to you now, Cleo.
Thank you very much, James and Lincoln. It is a real pleasure and honor to be with you. And I mean it, because Australia has a huge role to play in what's coming next, and getting the discussion started in terms of what's actually happening is going to be crucial, because the way that things are progressing now are not helpful for those who value democracy, freedom, anything that isn't the Chinese Communist Party. So I'm very grateful for this opportunity, and I'm personally grateful to Lincoln. He didn't mention the help that he gave in this fight to keep Daniel Soudani alive. It was actually kind of that serious, and he really stepped up, and in that capacity shows how Australia and Australians want to be part of the solution. So let's figure out how to do it. The first question is, why am I using the term Oceania? But you can go to the map, that's fine. Oceania is, instead of Pacific, South Pacific, Oceania is the term that, for example, the US National Security Council uses for the seat that looks at all of the Pacific Islands. So it includes Melanesia, Micronesia, Polynesia, and it's starting to become more used as terminology for the whole region. Whether Australia and New Zealand are part of the definition of Oceania varies, depends on who's using it. The thing that, the other piece of terminology is, Australia is used to calling this region the backyard. As the strategic shifts are happening in a much more visible way, we're starting to re-look at it, not in those terms, but as the old front line between Asia and the Americas. And obviously, Australia risks being encircled and cut off, actually, to be more precise, in this kind of a paradigm. So we're going back to a lot of those World War II maps, because those are the maps that the Chinese Communist Party is using to figure out strategic positioning. So if you take a look, for example, this is World War II in the Pacific, and you can see where some of those critical battles were. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Macon's not on here, but it's just above. Those are in the countries of the Solomon Islands and Kiribati, which in 2019 flipped to China. And they're already talking about rehabilitating an old US Air Force base on Canton Island in Kiribati for Chinese use. So in Beijing, they are looking at these maps and they're figuring out what strategic positioning was helpful the last time around, what they need to get this time around, but they're looking at doing it through political warfare, unlike the Japanese. And so and keep under that red line, under the radar, as they establish those beachheads. And this is quite overt. And we're starting to see big success on the part of Beijing's infiltration and consolidation of its interests across the region. And part of the reason for that is because Australia and New Zealand, which were sort of delegated under the Five Eyes construct to secure the region, haven't really been delivering. So next slide, please. Next, yeah. So we saw the Solomons and Kiribati switch to Taiwan. We've seen the fragmentation of the Pacific Island Forum. 5 of the Micronesian states left the forum, including the 3, or in the process of leaving the forum, including the 3 US freely associated states in the north. They were very clear they were going to do that. And it was because of a vote over the leadership of the Pacific Island Forum. And they said, look, we're not being represented at the forum. It's our turn to have leadership position in the forum. If we're not being represented, then there's no reason for us to stay. They were very overt about it. And there was an election between their candidate, Gerald Zakios, who's from the Marshall Islands, which is a country that recognizes Taiwan, and Puna, who's from the Cook Islands, who is favored by New Zealand for obvious reasons. And the vote was very close. And the vote came down to Australia, New Zealand, and France via French Polynesia's votes. And they voted for Puna, and the Micronesian countries left, basically cutting off the US freely associated states and Kiribati and Nauru in the north from the Pacific Island Forum structure. And so either that was a failure of intelligence on the part of Australia and New Zealand in terms of what would happen, or the perception is in Washington that Australia and New Zealand were perfectly fine with pushing the US countries, US associated countries, out of the forum. Either way, it's definitely not a good look. There's been a similar crisis in governance at the University of the South Pacific, where there was also a controversial vote where Australia and New Zealand backed the Fijian position, which pushed a very popular chancellor out to the point where instead of sitting in Fiji, he's now sitting in Samoa and sort of setting up a separate little governance structure there. Next one. And then, of course, there's the failure to support Premier Soudani, which was kind of so overt that the Australian actually had a headline that read, "Taiwan steps in as Australia bows out." Australia wouldn't help them economically, and in fact, was the leaders, the people who were representing Australia in the Solomon Islands. I'm not sure whether the message was passed on, but when I asked ASPI whether somebody had asked me whether they were going to help, they said they talked to somebody in Honiara and they had been told that Soudani had never asked for any assistance. And so then we got the letter from the High Commission that declined the assistance. So there's confusion even within the groupings that are trying to deal with this about what is being done and what isn't being done and why. So you can see these are all things that have just happened in the last couple of years. The Pacific Island Forum blew up, all this sort of stuff blew up. So what does Australia say it's trying to do in the region? What it says it's trying to do, one of the kind of key statements was made in the Foreign Policy White Paper, and this is around the goal of the step up, and that is to help integrate Pacific countries into the Australian and New Zealand economies and our security institutions. Now, this is perceived as, within the Pacific Islands, as essentially an attempt at colonizing the region, right? This is an overt, heavy-handed language, which doesn't kind of reflect well, because the assumption is that you can just take their security and economic structures and make them subsidiaries of existing Australian and New Zealand systems, which would be very difficult to do, in part, for example, with the economic structures, because they have no social welfare network. Their economies are completely different. So attempting to make them just sources of cheap labor or where you can dump products is going to completely, and it is, economically destabilize them to the point where it makes it much easier for China to come in with loans. And next slide, please. You can see this very clearly through the this push for the Pacer Plus trade deal. The Pacer Plus is I'm going to be interested to do a poll to know whether or not you've heard of Pacer Plus, because this is the major redefining trade architecture for the Pacific region, which is being pushed by Canberra and Wellington. And as it's described here by New Zealand, the goal is to reduce tariffs and red tape for New Zealand and Australian exporters and investors, as well as future-proof competitive access for our companies. So the goal is to make sure that New Zealand and Australian companies have a position of primacy in Pacific Island countries. There's no reason for Pacific Island countries to sign on to this deal. They already have duty-free and quota-free access to Australia and New Zealand. So it's very much of a one-way deal. And the outcome of it is going to be, because you will be paying less tariffs, lower government tariff revenue for Pacific Island countries, which already don't have a lot of money, which means they could be more in need of China loans. Next. Sorry. PRC front companies will set up in Australia and New Zealand and will use your Pacer Plus pathways for preferential access into critical infrastructure. They'll say they're Australian and New Zealand companies, but they'll be able to undercut real Australian and New Zealand companies because they're backed by the Chinese Communist Party. It also fragments the PICs economically, the Pacific Island countries economically. I mean, you talk about economic integration, but PNG and Fiji, who have the biggest economies, took a look at this deal and said, you must be nuts. This is really bad for us. We're not going to sign on. And the US freely associated states haven't signed on because they see from the American perspective that it's no good. So Pacer Plus disaggregates the economies instead of creating integration. Similarly, for security integration, this heavy-handed approach, I'll give you one case study in Tonga. Since 2006, there was a trilateral agreement between Tonga, Australia, and New Zealand, where New Zealand was forced to accept a New Zealand police officer as the Tongan police commissioner. Since then, these police commissioners, there have been a series of them, have targeted specific political classes for arrest. They went after the nobles. After the 2010 election, I was there, they arrested 4 out of the 9 nobles in Parliament. Those cases were subsequently acquitted. It was. It was clearly a targeted attempt to discredit.
Well, hang on, Cleo. You've just gone on to mute.
There we go. Are you okay?
There you go.
Yeah, okay, thanks. They seized the Foreign Affairs database from the Tongan Ministry of Foreign Affairs and sent it to New Zealand for analysis. They said that they wanted specific information about specific people, and the Tongans said, give us the names and we'll give you the information, and they just came in and took the database. They've arrested hundreds of Tongans for having a beer with friends, and if you have a conviction on your record in Tonga, it makes it very difficult to apply for a visa to go to Australia or New Zealand. So it becomes a control mechanism. And at the same time, they've done very little to tackle crime in and emanating from the Chinese community in Tonga. These police commissioners don't speak Tongan. They obviously don't speak Mandarin. And it's caused a distrust that stifled human flows within Tonga. They don't trust these guys because these guys are sworn New Zealand police officers. So the security integration has actually created a problem where there's they've broken lines of trust and communication within the intelligence flows within that country. So I don't, and this is going to be quite controversial, but I don't think that these policies are primarily being directed out of Canberra. I think a lot of them, I think the Pacific Islands Forum stuff, the University of South Pacific stuff, the Pacer Plus stuff is mostly being pushed out of Wellington. And saying that based on contacts that I have in country, because they're getting calls from New Zealanders saying, when are you going to ratify PACER Plus and that sort of stuff. So the question is, what is New Zealand up to? And I think one of the goals for New Zealand's foreign policy, it was kind of implied during the speech that the Minister of Foreign Affairs gave in 2021 about the relationship between New Zealand and China, the dragon and the Taniwa speech, where she talked about New Zealand being the Taniwa to the Chinese dragon. And she said, these are her words, Taniwa are endemic to Aotearoa and can trace their grouping across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. They symbolize a sense of guardianship. So she's saying, you know, we are this Taniwa, which represents this grouping, which is a Polynesian grouping. This has nothing to do with Melanesia or Micronesia. In many respects, one could surmise that New Zealand and the Pacific share a common Taniwa. Our historical, cultural, social, linguistic, and kin connections across the Pacific are significant. First of all, I'm not going to get into the race-based aspect of this, which wouldn't fly if you were doing it in any other part of the world. But she's basically saying, I'm a Maori. I've got all these Polynesian cousins and so-called cousins across the region. We are all the same, and we are representing our Polynesian family. The Taniwa and the dragon, similar and different, unique, able to adapt and resilient. New Zealand will contribute to build cooperation in areas of mutual interest, bringing the benefits to people in both countries and, I hope, the resilience of the Pacific. So what I think is they want to represent, especially Polynesia, in international relations, especially when it comes to China. So to be the entry point for China into Polynesia, which is why they don't particularly care about Micronesia leaving, because if the Pacific Island Forum gets smaller, then that increases their relative importance, because there's the number of Polynesian countries becomes the dominant number, and they see themselves as leading Polynesia, and they want to be, through, for example, PACER Plus, the entry point for China into the Pacific. This is, as you can see, there's no language in there that relates to Australia's role or Australia's relationship to any of this. And you know, if you think that they're soft on China, I would remind you what happened with ANZUS. This is a country that seems to, you know, they were heavily infiltrated by the Soviets, and that led in part, that was one of the reasons that we had all the problems with ANZUS. And I think currently heavily affected by the Chinese Communist Party. Anne-Marie Brady has done very good work on this, and that has become part of their vision of their role in terms of foreign policy and economic policy, in terms of being the conduit for China into the Pacific, especially Polynesia. And we saw it with things like Jan Yang, who was a member of the New Zealand Parliament after he had served 10 years at a spy school in China. He wrote a book on China's grand strategy in the Pacific Islands. I think China knows how useful, or they think they know how useful New Zealand can be for them into the Pacific. And there's New Zealand thinks, like with ANZUS, they can push the US, the Western relationship, to the breaking point without getting punished, whereas if they push against China, they might get economically punished. So they're willing to put a lot more stress on us than they are on them. The people of the Pacific know this problem. They've been being fought over for 140 years. This is Samoa fighting off, I think, the Germans, Americans, and British 120 years ago. Next slide, please. And you can put all of those up. And if you look at a petition that was recently given in by some people in Malaita about what they were complaining about what happens in China with Chinese infiltration into their societies and economies, this is better analysis than some that I've seen out of many of the think tanks, including a detailed description of the PRC doctrine of the three warfares in action in Malaita, where they say the government continually harasses the local government of Malaita through individuals, the media, and even the abuse of the legal process. That's the three warfares, China's three warfares. The people of the region know what's going on. Next slide, please. And our allies also know what's going on. This is a Japanese graphic of their perception of which exclusive economic zones have become basically Chinese dominated versus US friendly. And you can see there is just a solid barrier between the more friendly, US friendly North Pacific and what you've got just off of your shore. This is how the Japanese see it. The Japanese see the region being lost, especially from the south, your region heading up. Next slide, please. So the question is, what happens now? What do we do now? This is a map of the region with exclusive economic zone marked. So everything that's red on there is actual US territory, not freely associated state, actual territory, including Guam, Northern Marianas, that sort of stuff. There's a very big US presence in the Northern Pacific, as you can see. The very big French presence, that's the turquoise. The orange is New Zealand. So I think that, first of all, there needs to be a re-questioning of some of these New Zealand-led policies and whether they actually are in the best interest not only of Australia, but the Five Eyes and those who believe in democracy and all of the things that are so important for creating a fair society or, for creating what we value. But the other thing is potentially looking at new sorts of relationships. So perhaps in the Northern Pacific, in the Micronesian zone, looking at Australia working closer with Quad allies. So instead of bringing New Zealand up into, Palau, Micronesia, Marshall Islands, even Kiribati or Nauru, saying we want to work with the US and Japan and India, which has a whole other set of skills that it can bring, low quality skill, like low cost skills, like low cost pharmaceuticals and things like that, that can help displace some of the Chinese investment, and even Taiwan up in that zone, as opposed to just continuously aggregating your policy to the New Zealand policy, which may not be fit for purpose at the current time. So I think that, there are a lot of things changing in the region. Australia has an enormous amount to offer, but it would need to take a hard look at what's actually going on in the different regions and figure out whether it's working with the right partners across the zone in order to create the kind of stability, security, and prosperity that we all want to see, including the people of the Pacific. Thank you.
That was outstanding, Cleo. Thanks very much for that. Before we get into a couple of questions from James and I would like to welcome those that have come on to the call in the recent 5-10 minutes, and in particular, Senator Major General Jim Molan, who I think is now online with us. I would like to defer to Senator Molan if he has any particular questions and actually give him the right to ask the first question. I realise you only just came on, Jim, but if you would like to do that, we can get you off mute, I think. James, are you able to help me out there?
Jim should be able to demute. It's the microphone in the bottom left.
Yeah. Or has he dropped off? Oh, no, there he is. Okay. I'm trying to unmute him.
There. How's that, Lincoln?
Perfect, Senator.
Yeah. Listen, thank you very, very much. And I apologise for coming on so late and still dressed in my tracksuit at this appalling time of the day. But Cleo, that was fabulous. I heard about 10 minutes of it. And I think that our trust, our unwavering trust in New Zealand is a significant problem for us, that we should be much more sceptical of who is doing what to who. And I don't have any other points to make except that everything that I do and say in relation to the bigger issue of China versus the US versus the region, I put onto my website, which is jimmolan.com, and there will be a big article in the Australian, I think this weekend, from me for about 3,000 words on the natural extension of what, Cleo, you're talking about, which is the move from grey zone conflict to enhanced grey zone conflict to the option of actual war. I think Australia is changing in its views. I think within government there is certainly a view that things are very, very interesting at the moment, with Osmin coming up next week, with the statements that Peter Dutton as Defence Minister has made, and particularly that Josh Frydenberg as Treasurer has made in the last week. I think that there is a recognition that self-reliance is not self-sufficiency. Self-reliance doesn't mean cutting yourself off from the rest of the world. It means working in places like Micronesia. It means doing things as we did in Ramsey at great dollar cost, and reaping the benefits of what we've done there, yet maintaining prosperity of ourselves and the region. But Lincoln, thanks for organising. I'm sorry I took a bit too long to get on, but great to hear you. If it's recorded and I can sit down and go through your view graph slides again, your PowerPoints, I would very much like to do so.
Thank you so much, Senator. That's much appreciated, and thank you for your time for coming on. We indeed are recording this, and we will post it to YouTube after we've edited it a little bit, and we'll send you the link out there. And I would just add on to what Senator Molan was saying. Yes, indeed, he will have a 2,000 or 3,000 word piece coming out in the Australian, I understand, very shortly. And the Liberal Party Defence and National Security Policy Branch will be organising a similar webinar as this, with Jim presenting and discussing the points that he raises in that article. So what I'd like to do now, before we open it up to a few questions from the floor, I'm going to use my prerogative as chair of the branch to ask a question myself.
Do you mind, Lincoln, do you mind, just before you do that, can I tell everybody that put your questions in the bottom right? There's some shapes called activities. And if you have a question, you can create a question and then people can vote them up. That will help. Then when it comes time, I'll work through from the most voted questions down while we have time.
Sweet. Thanks, mate. So my first question is, Australia is the biggest donor of aid to the Pacific Islands, yet in the Solomon Islands, Chinese Communist government has more influence than Australia does. So where is our strategy failing, and what can we do to actually be effective? Because clearly whatever we're doing isn't working.
Right. So the reason that I put up that Ramsey graphic is because, as the senator said, I mean, that was a huge cost to Australia. Ramsey was a huge cost to Australia, but we're at a situation now where Chinese intervention is destabilizing the country again. You see Malaita Province, you see Guadalcanal, both of them bridling under this pressure being put on by the central government via Beijing to let the Chinese companies in, to let the Chinese workers in, and it risks triggering this sort of conflict again, which China would benefit from, because then they could be the ones to send in the peacekeepers, right, and have a military force right off the coast of Australia, and at the same time look good. And they are actively trying to position themselves at the UN as big players in the peacekeeping game, so to speak. So, you know, and it also puts the central government more in hock to China, because as they become more authoritarian, the West will back off from them, and China becomes kind of one of the few options. So the idea that we all want peace and security and stability in the Pacific, it's just China's doing it differently, is not accurate, they would benefit from conflict and increasing authoritarianism and disempowerment of the population, all that sort of stuff. So that's why that Ramsey thing was there, because it's not just the money issue. It's people have dedicated their lives, they served, whatever, and that's at risk. So often when there is an attack on what I'm doing, for example, from the Australia New Zealand academics, what they're saying is, oh, you don't know the details of these specific events from what, first of all, I do, but second of all, it's like they're focusing on the trees while the forest is on fire. And what you need to do is understand how fire works, right? So if you don't understand how China works, you can't protect these countries. And there are kind of some very clear ways of dealing with this. One is you expose corruption, and you don't participate in corruption. You don't try to buy off the people the Chinese are trying to buy off, because you'll never be able to outbid the Chinese. You find people like Daniel Suidani who are willing to literally die rather than take Chinese money, and make sure he has the protection he needs in order to explain to his people why democracy is a good thing. And at the same time, you don't let other people launder their money in Australia or buy, you don't fall into that trap. So first of all, you expose. Second of all, you ensure there's reciprocity in the relationships with China. I mean, these are all things that you need to do domestically as well when you're dealing with China. And then you offer the sort of things that they want. Most people in the Pacific, they want education for their kids. They want good health care. They want to just be able to live their lives quietly without being lectured to by do-gooders about why the way they're living is wrong. They want to be able to build their families and have some sort of stability and security. So scholarships, I mean, all the things that China is doing in that kind of way, but through Australia. And I would say, don't block your allies from trying to do the same thing. I have a firsthand experience from both the Japanese and the Indians that they wanted to do projects in the Pacific and and they were blocked by Australia because Australia wanted to have a finger in that pie, right? So trust your allies. Let them work with the people, perhaps under, like I said, under a quad construct or something like that. But if you hold it too tight, if you try to integrate it in terms of security and economics, as the white paper says, it won't work. It'll weaken their defenses. You're weakening their defenses to try to integrate them, and it's China that will come in and benefit from that. So it's not just about money. You need to listen to and find the people who share your values, and make sure that they're protected through exposure and reciprocity.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I'm going to throw over to James, and I just want to pick up on that point of, unrest in the Solomon Islands, as we well know, is nothing new. Australia had the Ramsey mission there at great cost. With the control that the Solomon Islands Prime Minister now has over his parliament, if there was to, and he's on record as being against the Ramsey mission and being very happy when the Australians left, were we to be replaced by Chinese peacekeepers, we think that they would never leave. We've seen what they've done in Tonga, building their barracks and those sorts of things. And I think that's a big issue, and we can chat about that at another time. But I want to hand over to James, who will ask a question, and then we'll go to the audience. Thanks, James.
I'm actually going to start with the question from Christopher Skinner. He asked, have China's actions in the Southwest Pacific transgressed the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS? And my sort of second part to that question would be, if they have, do they care?
Okay, that's a good question. Illegal fisheries aside, this hasn't been an issue yet. It gets to be kind of an interesting issue when you start looking at places like Kiribati, where if you have islands that are at risk of being eroded for whatever reason, and they bring in those magic island making dredgers that they've been using in the South China Sea to rebuild those islands, and perhaps say to, and they have offered them to Tuvalu, and Tuvalu said no. I'm not sure Kiribati at this point will say no, but if they don't say no and they bring in the dredgers, what they could say is, we'll reinforce Tarawa and we want to reinforce this uninhabited islet and set up a tourism or aquaculture center, whatever they want to call it, a weather monitoring station. Or they might bring it out to Canton and do it out there. So they have the technology to dramatically change islands. Whether that would affect the baselines is another question. The better question, or more pertinent question, is your second question, which is, do they care? And as part of the research that we did for Chatham House, we had a standardized survey that we sent to all 7 countries. And one question on that survey was, do you think the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea will be enforced by 2024? 6 of the countries thought it was a stupid question. Of course it would be. None of the Chinese thought it would be. None of them. And the only difference was if they were from a foreign policy background, then they thought it might be adjusted to make it more fit for purpose, for Chinese purpose. If they were from a defense background, they just didn't care. So there is no commitment in Beijing, overtly no commitment to the unconventional law of the sea, unless it constrains other actors.
Got it. Now we have a question from Franz here, who asks, he's a researcher, and he's asking if you have any evidence of the New Zealand police not pursuing criminal cases against the Chinese residents of the islands. He's curious about case studies, if there's anything you can mention.
If I could just butt in there, Cleo, before you go, it's actually in the Politico article, the answer to that question.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, and I wrote about it, like, I think, I don't know, maybe 5 or 7 years ago. There have been a lot of murders in the Chinese community that were never solved. There was, and I would say Tonga's not as lost to China as it might appear. It's another case where it just needs other options, and it could shift. I know that for a fact. That's why we went to Tonga, and we did, we held a closed door workshop with about half of the CEOs from government, and they were very interested, for example, in a relationship with India, because they, the person who was head of the Red Cross said, we ask for tents from New Zealand, and they show up 3 months later from India. We'd prefer to just deal with India. We'd prefer to send our students to go study in India, which is more culturally compatible, lower cost. The food is better, all that sort of stuff. So there are other pathways that can be developed. But again, when I was there, we had somebody who's coming from a university from India to talk to the Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Education, to see whether they could sort of set up some relationship. And the Indian needed to transit through New Zealand. And the New Zealand delayed her visa for so long that she missed her flight and canceled her trip. So there are a lot of very just practical issues around flight paths and visas that are real constraints on giving the Pacific Island countries other options.
You've spoken a little bit about what we should do. I want to sort of ask a general question around that, just to double down. So you see a lot of, from your perspective in your research, you can see a lot of areas that we're falling short, and as a result, we're creating a real problem for ourselves. What is, I want to talk more about low-hanging fruit, stuff that we should do here and now. You mentioned getting the Quad involved in the northern area. So, and that's a really good sort of takeaway from this. Is there anything else that you can think of? And you've also mentioned some more of the New Colombo plan, sort of education in the region. I'd love to hear more. How's our human? What else should we be looking at?
Daniel Sudani is sitting in Brisbane. He's been there for over a month and a half. Nobody's gone to talk to him. He would be in a much better position than I would be to tell you how to build that relationship between Australia and the people who are willing to fight against Chinese Communist Party aggression in the Solomon Islands than I would. And you've got a lot of people like him who are brave and who are around. And I would say, you know, the other thing is look very carefully at the sort of people you're working with. You know, the ideal person to work with in the Pacific Islands is somebody who's hard to deal with. Because if they're hard for you to deal with, that means they probably have a pretty strong sense of self, and they'll be hard for the Chinese to deal with. So you want somebody who is, you know, you want somebody like Daniel Sudani, for example, who's a God-fearing man, devoted to his family. He's all about his community. He doesn't want to escape with suitcases full of cash to somewhere else. You know, he wants his community to be good and healthy. And there are a lot of people like that, but they're not the ones you meet. The consultants that you're sending out are meeting to a large part the sharks that are swimming on the top of the water looking to feed off the extra bits of chum that the consultants are throwing around to try to make it look like they're accomplishing something, right? So, you know, you need to, and you've got those relationships, you know, but you need to go to church, and you need to go to the school graduations, and you need to, you know, go where the people are and pay them the respect that they deserve on their home turf, and then ask them, you know, how can your life be more secure? You know, what are the problems?
Yeah.
That sounds like the kind of feedback that you would get from human intelligence, whether that be an ASIS function, Australian government agency function, where we've got people who in our backyard, and we call the Pacific Islands our backyard, and we call them our families. That sounds like we should have those people on the ground talking to those sorts of people, including Daniel Sudani. And I'm just shocked that Daniel Sudani has come back from Taiwan, where he was invited by President Tsai, and is sitting in Brisbane for 6 weeks plus and has had no contact with the Australian government.
Yeah, I mean, what can I tell you? I mean, I'm very busy. Like I'm my actual area of focus is kind of India and the Quad and that part of the Indo-Pacific, and people are leaking documents to me. They shouldn't be leaking. It shouldn't be me. It should be, you know, you guys who are closer to home, who can get more stuff done. But something seems to have broken down. And when I get information and I bring it out, try to bring it out to colleagues in Australia and New Zealand, I have to say Lincoln's one of the few that's taken it seriously and really tried to do something with it, for which I'm truly grateful. You know, so I'm sure the people are there. If I can't find them, and I think that some of those people, I know Daniel Sudani would have been left to die, right? If it wouldn't have been for a group of people, which included an American and an Indian, who, and particularly the Indian, got involved and called up President Tsai's office directly because he happened to know her and got involved. That's how he got his the treatment that he needed. You know, Lincoln helped a lot, and the American help. It was all just personal trust-based relationships. It would be nice if there would be a better system that wasn't reliant on, you know, us being available at that time.
Yeah. Now, Nick, you had your hand up. Would you want to take the floor and ask a question?
Yeah, look, thank you. This has been a fantastic talk, Cleo. Very interesting. Unfortunately, most of the question I've got is not for you. It's for the New South Wales Liberal Party and the Liberal Party in general. You've talked about relationships and working those personal relationships and having the discussion. And I think the first point raised when I dialed in was, this is not on the front page of the newspaper. Well, I remember endless conversations led by Alexander Downer about foreign affairs issues. So my question is to the policy branch, how are we going to get a foreign affairs actually discussed within the media and the minister to engage with us and defence about these sort of important issues in a transparent way? Because at the moment, if it's happening, it's entirely opaque.
It's a good question, and if I can kind of summarize it, it's something that we can see happening now that will have an effect in the medium and long term. How do you get people interested in it now? I don't know.
Well, yes, and sorry for Cleo, it was we've talked about foreign affairs aspects, but what is the US military specifically doing per island? And is that at all, can that be at all transparent? Or do you have any confidence that our Defence Force is working with your Defence Force on these issues?
Okay, so
we can talk about here.
So Lincoln very kindly hid my dirty secret from you, which is I'm actually Canadian. So I have no moral superiority when it comes to standing up to China on this. I do work a lot out of the U.S. and I am based at a U.S. think tank, and I would like to say very clearly there is an enormous amount of admiration in the U.S. for the way Australia has been standing up to China at great cost. There is an understanding of that and an appreciation of that. And I think it's a matter of linking up that approach to what's going on in the Pacific. I think that whoever's making the decisions about the Pacific Island engagement they're not the same group that's making the decisions about what to do about China from an Australian perspective. And it would be good to link those up more closely. In terms of the U.S. is, there's some big things potentially coming online, including the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, which may have a lot more money for Pacific Islands, and the Blue Pacific Act, which is kind of head case out of Hawaii. So there is a lot more awareness about this issue of the Pacific Islands. And it is because there is a perceived failure by our Five Eyes partners, Australia and New Zealand, in the region with the switch of the Solomons and the switch of Kiribati. And so there is a thought that, okay, the US needs to get re-involved. And my argument is, I think you need to disaggregate Australia from New Zealand. You need to start to look at Australia and its direction and its capabilities, and the way it can work with partners is very different than what New Zealand seems to be trying to do. So that's the discussion that we're kind of starting to hope to have. And in terms of how to get that prioritized within DC and also potentially within Canberra, that's why the Quad becomes important. Because if the Japanese ambassador and the Indian ambassador are talking to Canberra and saying, what are you doing in the Solomons? That might trigger a different kind of response than, if nobody is bringing it up or saying, we want to come and work with you, or let's figure out how we're going to do Micronesia. So basically it becomes much more of a group effort, but not a sub rosa Five Eyes, New Zealand-led, Polynesia-focused thing, but more of a Quad plus Taiwan, in some cases, because several of those countries recognize Taiwan, construct that I think would probably help both in Canberra and in DC in getting some focus onto the structure.
Just a continuation of that, Cleo, it was a question asked by Christopher Skinner again, and I've turned it into a poll question. I'd like to hear your views on New Zealand's membership of the Five Eyes, given their foreign policy views right now.
Yeah, so, and again, as a Canadian, I don't have a lot of high ground on this, but there are, as you know, sort of technical reasons why New Zealand is you know, just in terms of where the cables are, and also Antarctic issues, things like that, why New Zealand is. And there are some very good people in New Zealand who are similarly not particularly happy with their leadership, you know, in various communities there. So I definitely don't want to denigrate them and their efforts. I think that it would, you know, it would be very hard to justify New Zealand inclusion and not Japan's inclusion once they figure out their, you know, they need to sort out the way they do their security clearances. But, you know, we need to, again, start to rethink some of these legacy approaches that cruised during the Cold War, although not particularly effectively if you look at what happened with ANZUS and see what's going to be fit for purpose moving forward. We don't have a lot of time. And part of the reason why I'm coming out so strong on this New Zealand thing is to give cover to allies within New Zealand who are concerned about their direction, so that they can tell their people, we're getting called out, and maybe we can't push the West and the US and allies as far as we thought we could. Maybe we do have something to lose. So, you know, it would be nice not to have to abandon them, but rather to make them realize how serious this is and how essential it is for them to course correct.
Okay, thank you. We've got 1 minute left. I'm going to give Wayne the floor for one quick question to wrap us up.
There we go. Sorry, I was muted. Cleo, is it BC you're from?
Sadly, I'm from Montreal.
Oh, that's a nice place too. I love Canada. It's great. I picked your accent when the way you say you use and that is sort of got a bit of a funny way of saying it, but not funny. But you can pick the accent. I asked a question earlier, which what I was wondering was, is the Biden administration on board with the resistance to China, or is the USA's some $26 trillion of debt reducing their ability to stand firm?
So your guess is as good as mine about what's going on, especially after Afghanistan. I mean, the Afghanistan situation, it shocked us, shocked us all. Mm. But it's actually, so what it's done, again, I do a lot of work with India. And so what the Indians are now saying, for example, is maybe the Quad is more of a trilateral, and they're going to be looking more to Australia to see, because again, Australia's stand against China has been noted, and and will be valued. So I don't know. I don't understand it, so I can't analyze it.
Mm. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, Cleo. Now I'm going to hand it over to Lincoln, who's just going to wrap things up.
Yeah, thanks very much, James. And would very much like to thank Cleo Paskal for honouring us to come and speak with us today. Very much thank our members, and indeed Senator Moland for coming online as well. He's a very strong supporter of our policy branch and works very closely with us, and wherever we can support Senator Moland, we will. And this is a very important topic to Australia that we've been listening to. It is certainly our backyard. We don't talk about it enough. We call them our family, and yet we are under, well, I mean, we could be under attack. And that, you know, we could get written off by saying that. But the fact is that it's very close to Australia. The Chinese have moved in. We understand that. It could be in a matter of months to years before we're facing a situation that we don't want to face. And so by raising these issues in forums like this, we hope that we can help in any way that we can to affect change, and at least have the policymakers start understanding this more, and perhaps reading outside the lines that they're currently reading. Because yes, we hear the familiar refrain that, oh, Australia is the largest aid donor. Well, okay, we've been the largest aid donor for a long time, but can we ask the government or the bureaucrats that continually to say that, well, what have you produced? Okay, so whatever you're doing is not effective. So we need to start looking at other areas, and we hope that in forums like these that we can do that, because at no time do we want to be encircled or become a vassal state of China. Australians do not want to live on their knees, and we will not live on our knees. And so this is important to us. And so we hope that this can go some way to help that change. And again, if we could all clap, I know we're all virtual, but if we could please give Cleo, Paskal a clap. And we will end it there. And I will just end with a reminder that we'll be doing another one of these for Senator Molan in the coming weeks. So stay tuned for that and many more. Again, thank you very much for all of those that logged on. We will have this on YouTube and maybe Rumble, I'm not sure. But we'll put that up and we'll let you know where it is and the link. So thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lincoln. Thanks, Jane. Thanks, Cleo.
Thank you. Well done. Well done, and Lincoln. Well done. Thanks, mate. Thanks, Leo.
Thanks, Senator.